For those that don't know me, I am Annette Click. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School here at the University of Mississippi. And my email is there. Please do feel free to email me if there's anything you want to talk about. I'm pretty good at responding to email most of the time. So I hope you'll reach out. And then as we talked about, if you want to drop things in the chat or if you just want to speak up, if there are questions or comments, please feel free to do so. And so we are going to talk today about preparing for the job talk as part of the Acing the academic interview. The job talk is a unique experience, and I am going to talk about that, but I'm also going to talk a little bit more broadly about the interview process itself. So just to get started, I'd love to hear how people thought about preparing for other interviews that you may have or what you already know. So for those of you that interviewed for graduate school, how did you prepare for that interview?
I started reading about the professor I am having my interview with to show him that I'm committed and also to show him that I have an interest in the program or the research that he's working on, and trying to go through the Google on tips how to act professional and confident.
Those are excellent strategies, and you've hit on a couple of key things already. So looking up the people that you're going to be interviewing with because it shows interest, that's absolutely true. And that doesn't go away in the academic interview when you're thinking about interviewing for a faculty position. So that's great. And yeah, thinking about confidence, that's an important piece as well. And there's a lot of resources on our campus that can help with that. The Career Center is one of those resources where you can even practice interviewing, and we'll talk about some other sort of practice strategies today as well. What other sort of tips or things have that you know about, or general strategies to use when interviewing?
I would say don't prep the night before. I know that seems silly, but take your time, especially like for grad school. For me, I was looking at like 6 or 7 schools when I applied for grad school. And then currently I recently just had a phone interview with one school. So I spent 4 or 5 days, just not a ton of time, but a little bit each day to kind of get myself well-rounded. That way you're not trying to cram the night before.
Yeah, absolutely. So you all know this, there's probably some things that you can kind of cram the night before and it all turns out all right. But when we're thinking about the process of getting a job, and doing an interview, we definitely want to take our time and make sure that we've done our prep work. That's going to be really critical for some parts of the academic interview in particular. A lot of times because there's a lot of different pieces and that interview can be long. Also, it's good to go into the night before an interview sort of feeling like you are ready and getting a good night's sleep to the best that you can. I know, some of us get nervous. I get nervous sometimes. And so I do understand not being able to sleep. But to the extent we can, do those sort of things up front, that's really important. And in some ways, an academic interview, it tends to be a lot longer than some of the interviews that we might think of for other kinds of positions. And so when we think about how interviewing might differ, that's one of the things that we'll talk about is sometimes academic interviews may take longer and they may have multiple interviews. So, we just heard that there's a sort of a phone or internet interview, and that is something that's becoming more and more popular in general. And then of course, during COVID, universities are having to rely even more on those kinds of interviews. So I do think it's good to keep in mind, how might the academic interview differ from other kinds of jobs as you're preparing, as you're thinking about what you're going to do. But at the same time, if you've interviewed for another job, there are some things that still apply, that still transfer. As you think about sort of the goal of leaving a positive impression, the goal of being prepared, but also making sure you get the information you need during the interview process, because an interview is actually a two-way process. Certainly the prospective employer is interviewing you, but you are also interviewing them, right? Trying to figure out, is this a place that I want to be? And so that's important. That's as important as them interviewing you. So if we think about some general overviews of the academic interview, first of all, it's good to know that sometimes there are multiple interview rounds. So in the last faculty search I chaired, we had 10 people who did a Zoom interview, and we brought 4 people to campus. Sometimes it won't be that many, and sometimes there may not be multiple rounds of interviews, but that's not uncommon in an academic setting when you're interviewing for faculty positions. The other thing is, it's pretty common that there are multiple candidates for the job. In fact, some universities may have a requirement that the program can't just interview one person for the faculty position from an equity standpoint and an HR standpoint. So those are a couple of things to keep in mind. The next thing is that your discipline really sort of specifies or directs what that interview process is going to look like. So we know that there are some disciplines where they like to do interviews at academic conferences. My discipline is not one of those disciplines, and some of those interview strategies may be changing because it means a lot of expense for a graduate student to get to a conference. And historically, some of those interviews have taken place in hotel rooms, which is not the most comfortable place to have an interview. So those are changing, but at the same time, it is important to know that your discipline will influence how and when interviews take place. And it is good to talk to your mentors, figure out, are there specific places, like is there a conference where interviews in the discipline didn't take place, or are they always based on campus? The next thing I want to say is that the interviews that are campus interviews tend to be pretty long. So like a Zoom or phone interview could be as short as 20 minutes. It could be as long as an hour. It's possible you would meet with a couple different groups via Zoom, but if you come to campus, you're probably going to spend an entire day interviewing. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's important, but it is good to know ahead of time that it's going to be a long interview process, and there's probably not a lot of other positions where people would spend an entire day interviewing. And some academic positions, you might spend more than a day interviewing, and I'll show you a couple of sample schedules later. But they really can last quite a long time. And I do want to make clear that generally a schedule will be provided to you. And if they don't provide you with one, it is okay to ask. It's very acceptable to say, as I prepare, I would love to see a copy of the schedule. So hopefully they give it to you without you having to ask. But if you have to ask, that's okay, because it is common and expected in academia that there would be a schedule, because they're coordinating you meeting with a lot of different individuals all over campus. And so they have to have a plan and a schedule before you arrive. And then with that, you'll meet with multiple different groups and individuals in most cases. So usually it's not just meeting with the search committee. In academia, there's almost always a search committee involved rather than a single person. But you'll usually meet with that search committee, and as well as a lot of other individuals. And similar to the, it's okay to ask for a schedule tip, it's also okay to ask, who will I be meeting with? So that you can prepare, like we heard earlier, so that you can research people. And we can talk a little bit about why you'd want to do that when you're meeting with a lot of different people, but there can be some value in knowing a little bit about who you're going to meet with. The next thing I want to highlight is that in academic searches, sometimes you will get the opportunity to identify other people you want to meet with. This is done sometimes because people want to know, like, what's it like to be a person like me on this campus? So I want to talk to someone else that shares similar characteristics to me. Maybe I'm underrepresented in my discipline, and so I'd like to meet with somebody outside of my discipline so I can get a sense of what is the campus climate like. But this is also an opportunity for some people to maybe talk to a collaborator that might be in a different department that you would be interested in meeting with and trying to figure out, is this someone that I could do some research with that would be on this campus? I do recommend, if you are given the opportunity to identify who you want to meet with, that you go ahead and take it. And you don't necessarily have to tell the chair of the search committee why you're asking to meet with someone, although sometimes that can be helpful when they're approaching that person to meet with you. But I do encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity to meet with others. And then the last sort of general tip is to be responsive to inquiries of the chair from the search committee. So scheduling academic searches is often a lot more back and forth on the interview scheduling part than maybe some other positions where you may be told, like, this is the day and the time of your interview. Typically for academic searches, there's going to be some sort of flexibility in terms of trying to figure out, like, when could you interview? Recognizing that people have various commitments. You may be teaching a class, so maybe you teach on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and so you really, you can't be gone from class for whatever reason. You can't miss teaching that class. It's not possible to have a substitute. So, that might be a time where, you want the Friday slot instead of the Thursday slot. So those are, some important things as you're working on this, with the chair of the search committee, to be sure to respond to them quickly so that they can help get that schedule put together, because they really are trying to get a lot of different people to meet with you while you're there. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is sort of what modern interviewing looks like. And this is not limited to academic positions, but I think there's some important things to understand with modern interviewing. And so the first thing, it's kind of like a cover letter. You're going to be asked questions, obviously, and to ensure equity, search committees more and more have a set list of questions they're going to ask you at the beginning, and they're going to ask every candidate they interview. And it's really important to understand this. It's true in the cover letter as well. If they're looking for certain things, you want to be sure that you've commented on those things in the cover letter, or that you are responding to that specific question, because there might be a rubric designed to evaluate how you answered that question. And if you end up not answering the question, then you may not do as well in the rubric. And it's designed to help create equity, but it is important to understand that this is a common practice in the search committee. And so, things that can be helpful as you're interviewing, if you get a long question, and you'll probably get a long question, feel free to write it down. You can ask people to repeat questions. You want to manage those long questions, because sometimes it's easy to forget a key part that you do want to be sure to respond to. And then sort of related to that, you want to make sure that you answer the question they asked. Sometimes, we might sort of get distracted or have something that we want to say that's kind of related to the topic at hand, but you want to be sure that you answer that question because of that rubric approach. And then, be ready for common questions. And as a part of this, you can ask people who are in your field, maybe in your department, like, what are the kinds of questions that your own department likes to ask people they're interviewing for a faculty position. So be ready for those. It's good to be ready for curveball questions. Sometimes they're just meant to lighten the mood. Sometimes maybe they're meant to see how you respond to the unexpected. But no, you could get some weird questions. This could be anything from, like, what's your favorite book that you've read that's not, a book in your discipline. So that's not necessarily really related to doing the job, but it might be sort of just getting a sense of who you are as a person. And there are definitely some downsides to asking those questions, but they do get asked, and they're technically not illegal. It is good to know which questions are illegal to ask you, and then to think about, how would you want to respond if you're asked those questions, knowing that you do not have to respond to illegal questions. And if you have questions about which questions are illegal to ask of a candidate, I'd be happy to talk about that. But also want you to know that just because, for example, it's not legal to ask about someone's marital status, but that doesn't mean you can't talk about that if you want to talk about that. And so there's kind of this balance between, some people will approach it, I'm not going to share personal information because I want to be evaluated on my merits. And other people might share personal information because if this is not an environment where they're going to support me as who I am entirely, then I don't want to be here. And both of those are valid approaches to thinking about, how you want to talk about who you are as a person. But again, good to know that there are questions that you're not supposed to be asked. And if you are asked them, you have the right to refuse to answer them. And then the last thing in modern interviewing, there are a lot of different types of universities out there and different types of departments. And so you really want to prepare for the type of institution and department that you're interviewing with. You know, if it's a research heavy institution and a research heavy department, you know, expect for there to be a lot of focus on that during the interview. If it's more teaching focused, then expect that to be the dominant theme of your interview, but prepare knowing a bit about the department and the institution. So we talked about, you know, doing the research ahead of time, and that becomes especially important when the phase of the interview, which will come up a lot if you do an on-campus interview, where you know, somebody says to you, what questions do you have? And you do want to have questions. You always want to have questions, because questions say, hey, I'm interested. Saying I have no questions right now means maybe I'm not that interested. That's how it gets read, even if that's not quite true. So it's good to go ahead and think of some questions ahead of time. Some of us are really good at generating questions off the top of our head. Some of us maybe not. If it's an all-day interview, it can be kind of exhausting too. So it's good to have some questions ahead of time, and you can write them down. You can have them written down, you know, but you do want to make sure that you're not asking questions that are really obvious from the website. You know, so there are plenty of things that you may not be able to learn about from the website. Like, you know, what does the teaching load look like? What are the students like to teach in this particular area? What's it like to live in this community? What's it like to work in this department? You know, those are things, those are feel questions that are hard to just read on a website. So those can be some easy ones that you may want to think about going in with as you ask questions. And as I mentioned before, you're interviewing them to figure out, is this a place I want to work? Is this an environment where I would thrive? Will this give me the kind of life that I want in my career? So framing your questions in that way can be helpful in getting you the information you need. And the way you ask questions, the questions you ask also communicate something about who you are to the prospective department that you are perhaps going to work within. And then the other thing that I think can be really critical, and that I've unfortunately seen sometimes people make the mistake of, is you want to avoid framing questions in a way that shows that you're a poor fit. So, you know, let's say that you're interviewing at a teaching university. You know, you wouldn't want to frame a question saying, you know, I really like to focus on my research, and so, you know, I'm trying to figure out, you know, how many classes I'm going to have to teach a semester. You know, that how many classes am I going to have to teach a semester? Some sort of this subliminal message of, I don't really want to do this. So instead, you know, framing it as like, I'd like to learn more about what the teaching, you know, what the teaching load typically looks like and how decisions are made about who's teaching what courses, as well as maybe support for more junior faculty who are working on getting their research going so that they can be competitive and ready for a tenure. So there are ways to frame questions that don't put you in a position where you seem like a poor fit to the institution, but still get you that information you need. So we talked before about sort of that research piece. And again, it comes up with this idea of knowing who you're going to meet with. I do recommend researching each person. Hopefully you don't have a list of 40 people you're going to meet with. And if you do, then you may have to decide to prioritize some people. But it's good to just know at least a little bit of something about each person. In part, it lets you make a connection. You know, you can ask them questions that are a bit more focused on them. You know, you might discover that someone's research sort of connects a little bit with the research you want to do. And so you can talk about potential research collaboration opportunities if you were to be a faculty member there. So there's some real advantages to knowing a little bit about who you're going to meet with. And that will also be helpful, perhaps depending upon the nature of the interview and preparing for, you know, for the way you present your job talk. If you do a teaching demonstration, you know, it's good to know, am I going to be meeting with students during the interview process? Because you'll want to have different questions that you would probably ask the students than what you might ask your future colleagues. Other things sort of going into the interview, you know, it's good to be prepared. That was already mentioned. Have a few copies of your CV. More and more, you're not going to need to share that because, you know, you probably send it in as a PDF and it probably got shared with everyone who's meeting with you. But it can't hurt to have a few copies with you. You do want to have multiple ways. If you have to do any kind of presentation, have multiple ways to access that. You know, so have it on a thumb drive. I know that more and more we don't use thumb drive. have it on the web where you can access it, maybe also have it in an email so that there's multiple ways to get to it in the event that you can't take advantage of a more classic, whatever your original plan was. And I see there's a thing in the chat. So regarding researching the individuals you speak with, what are your thoughts if there's a minimal information available on the website and the internet? That's a great question. And I think, if you're meeting with colleagues or future colleagues that are faculty, hopefully you can find some information about their research or their publications to kind of try to glean a little bit of information about them. You definitely don't need to go dig into their Facebook accounts and try to find out a ton of personal information about them. But to the extent that you can sort of see if you can at least identify maybe what are their research interests, I think that can be helpful. So I hope that helps answer questions a little bit. It's good to at least be able to figure out what is their role on the campus. Is this a potential colleague in my department, or maybe this is someone who works in the dean's office that I would need to work with on getting grant submissions put through, or maybe this is the department chair. But making sure you know people's role. Hopefully on the schedule, when you find out who you're meeting with, it will say their title. But sometimes titles can be odd on campuses, and so it's good to try to get a sense of what's their role, and if they are doing research or teaching, what might be their interests very broadly. So probably not the same depth that you might have researched maybe a mentor that you wanted to work with, but still getting some information as you go into the day. Let's see. The other 2-3 things about that day, planning for the day. If you're interviewing all day long, it's a long day. I'll show you schedule in a minute, but it's not uncommon to maybe have stuff that starts at 7:30 and goes until 8 p.m. And there'll be some breaks in there, but that's a long day. And so, we vary in how we get ready for that kind of time commitment, that kind of long-term need for energy that's going to last all day. And then similarly, sometimes you may be going between buildings. So thinking about, how am I going to be comfortable if I have to go between buildings, if there's a big stretch, so sometimes that can look like if it's winter and it's cold, you're going to want a coat. Something as simple as that. So planning for the day. I already mentioned getting some questions from your advisor and maybe practice answering the questions. That doesn't mean you have to memorize your answers. So it's more just an opportunity maybe to get a little more comfortable answering the questions, to have some idea of what you might say to those common questions that you're probably going to get asked. And then one thing that anytime you're interviewing for a faculty position, if there's any chance that you might be teaching, you're probably going to be asked what courses you could teach. And so it's really good to be able to talk about that. And you want to do it in a way that doesn't say, I'm going to take over this course, because you never know what the person in the room you're meeting with, or in the group that you're meeting with, what they like to teach. And so you don't want to necessarily come across as insisting that you take over their course. It is okay to have similar interests. It's also good to figure out if this was an opening created by somebody leaving or retiring, what are the gaps that they have? Where do they need someone to teach? And to the extent that that aligns well with you, to go ahead and say that. I personally think it's probably best to avoid saying these are the things I absolutely would not teach. Although in some disciplines, there may be clear areas where people would never teach. Their expertise is in area A, and so they would never teach a course in area B. If you're in one of those disciplines, it's probably, you probably don't even have to say, I wouldn't teach in this other area because it's so far removed from my own. But you never quite know, and that's part of that researching the environment you're going to be in, because sometimes maybe the institution, maybe here on our campus, these programs are really separate and faculty never cross teach, but maybe at the institution you're interviewing, they have figured out how to make those programs overlap a little bit more. So it's a good idea to think about what can you teach and to try to present it in a way that's open and not from an angle of saying, yeah, I would never teach that course. I'd never agree to teach that course. It is okay to say, I don't have a lot of experience teaching that particular content. So I would definitely need to do some preparation if you're asked about whether or not you'd be willing to teach something that's way outside of what your sort of main area of expertise is. All right, so these are the sample interview schedules, and I know that they're probably a little tiny. I'm mainly sharing them because I think they do a nice job of just showing what a day can look like. So in this particular one, it's a one-day interview, and the person's going to do breakfast on their own. But you see, then they start at 8:30, and they're going to have back-to-back meetings. There's a teaching demonstration in this one, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. And then there's a time to meet with students. Sorry, COP is the abbreviation for the program. I meant to pull that out. There's lunch with the search committee and the department head. So that means it's probably, the lunch is an interview, even though it's lunch. There's time to prepare for the research talk. And then there's some meetings with a few other people on campus, including the dean and the department head, and another person in the dean's office. And then there's dinner with the faculty, with the program faculty that night. And so you can see it goes kind of all day. And then this is kind of a 1.5 day long interview sample, which they can't even go longer than this. In this case, breakfast is itself also an interview meeting. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner on the first day are all interview meetings. There's meeting with the search committee, there's a research presentation built in, meeting with program faculty, meeting with other department faculty that maybe are in different disciplines than your own. Again, meeting with people in the school or college that maybe support research efforts, maybe meeting with someone from a partner entity on campus, dinner with the faculty, and then the next day, meeting with graduate students. So there's time built in for that. Meeting with potential collaborators, so that's sort of the who do you want to meet with on campus. Meeting with, again, the faculty. Sometimes you'll have multiple meetings with the faculty or multiple meetings with the search committee. And then almost always you'll meet with the department chair and probably the dean or a representative of the dean. So that's just an overview of what those schedules might look like. So now let's get into the job talk itself, or the research talk. And so sometimes people will call this a job talk, sometimes they'll call it a research talk. Usually, if you're interviewing for an academic position, they're thinking about the same thing. So this is your time to show your expertise. So as you're preparing, you want to make sure that you're setting yourself up in a way that you can really do that. And a part of that is to be careful about using the word we. So a lot of times graduate students have gotten really good at giving other people credit for what they're doing. So, it can feel like I'm working with my mentor on this dissertation, and, like it really feels like a we project, but in reality, it's your dissertation. And so, to the extent that you can say I or my when it is in fact your research, that can be really important in communicating that confidence that we talked about. That's obviously not to say, if it's truly a group project, you may have some research that you've done in collaboration with other people. You do want to give appropriate shared credit where it's due. But to the extent that you can sort of build into your mind that this dissertation is mine and this thesis was mine, those are really helpful things to lead with as you're talking about your research, as you're presenting. And of course, if you happen to have publications, again, this is thinking about academic positions. If you have publications in your area, highlight those as part of your job talk where the work has already been published. In some disciplines, people end up having lots of publications by the time they do a job talk, and some they may not have any. It really varies depending upon the discipline you're in. And then as you think about this research talk, you want to create a story. So sometimes you may focus on just one project. Maybe your dissertation is really your main research project, and so that's going to be your whole story. But you may also have a couple different research projects that you've done that can fit together. And I encourage you to think about, like, how can I fit them together, even if they seem a little different. So I'll give you the example from my own research. So my master's thesis essentially focused on college students' experiences with disordered eating and how disordered eating may present during the course of the fall first year freshman semester. And So from that, I didn't necessarily get the results I wanted, and my dissertation went in a slightly different direction, but I was able to talk about how that direction made sense based on those results I got from my master's thesis. So my dissertation focused more on family influences, and my story was that, you know, basically what I had found is that a lot of times disordered eating was present before people ever got to college, and so we didn't see the bump that I had expected to see, which means that, you know, we should look at things that happen before you get to college, like what's happening maybe in the family environment and in your peer environment in high school, that sort of thing. So you want to tell a story about your research. You want to put it in a frame. And, you know, if you're struggling to do that, hopefully there are some people in your, you know, your advising group that you can kind of connect with to talk through, like, how can I present this as sort of a coherent story of the research I do. The reason being that that illustrates your line of research. That's something we sometimes talk about, is having a line of research. That's not to say all your research has to perfectly fit together, but in general, you do want to communicate that you're going to be an expert in something. You're going to develop some expertise in something, and you have some expertise in something. So to the extent you can weave that story together, that's going to make a big difference. And that helps you sort of set up for the next thing. Part of your job talk, part of your research talk is going to be, you know, here's research I've done, but there should at least be one slide on here's what I plan to do next, because your future employer wants to know that you have more ideas than just what you've already done. And so having that plan, and go ahead and put it in the PowerPoint slide. Go ahead and do that on the front end, but have that plan for what's going to happen next. And I do want to mention, and we'll continue to talk about the research talk for a few more slides, but it's important to balance how you present the information. It's okay to have some extra slides with, you know, like if people start asking you a lot of questions about some of your studies or some of your research, you probably have a sense of what gets people excited about the stuff you've done. You know, it's okay to have extra slides where you can go into some more detail if somebody asks. So it's sort of there. It's almost desirable to have them wanting to know a little bit more about what you've done. That's not to say you want to share too little that they're kind of lost or don't know what you've done, but it's okay to not tell them everything that you've done in a particular research project. It's okay for there to be a mystery left that they can ask you a question or two about. Hopefully that makes sense. So the next thing is to really think about balance during your presentation, and there's multiple pieces to that. So one of them is knowing who's going to be in your audience. Is it going to be just faculty that would be, you know, your colleagues in your department, and they all have sort of a similar disciplinary expertise to yourself? Or might there be people from other areas of campus or other disciplines, or maybe there's going to be some students, maybe graduate students or even undergraduate students are invited to attend your job talk. And so obviously, if you're working with students, you may be thinking about making sure that you're not overly, you know, that you take time to explain concepts so that they're not lost during the job talk, so that they still understand what you're talking about. You may not spend as much time explaining those concepts if everyone, you know, is going to be a person with expertise in your same discipline. Then you might be able to sort of jump over that level of detail. And then you also, of course, have to manage time. So, you know, research talks might be scheduled for, usually they're scheduled for somewhere between 40 minutes to an hour and a half. And an hour and a half is quite a bit of time, but if they're 40 minutes, that 40 minutes goes fast. So you need to make sure that you've balanced how much detail can I really fit in here with the time that I have. And so being strategic, and that's part of, you know, that comment earlier about, you know, don't wait till the night before to prepare, because you can't prepare a good research talk just doing it the night before. It's good to get it prepared ahead of time and to practice it with people. So before I jump into that practice, you'll also want to be strategic with your visuals. So, you know, my presentation here is not so great in this regard. I didn't put in a lot of graphics and visuals, but as you think about presenting your work, are there graphics or visuals that help illustrate what you're talking about? Those of you that have participated in the 3MT competition, the 3-minute thesis, you know, you get one slide with visuals and you have to be really strategic there. That's great practice for this. So thinking about how can I use visual information instead of just having tons and tons of words on the slide, and then being able to talk about the visuals without the words on the slide. So maybe you have some figures or, or charts or graphics that illustrate your findings if you did a research project. Maybe they illustrate the group differences if you're doing some statistical analyses. So having that instead of a lot of words, and then you being able to describe the image that depicts what you found, can really create a nice experience for the audience, so they're really seeing and hearing things in different media. So now you do want to practice. I recommend, if you can, if you have a lab or other grad students in your department, practice with them so that you can get their feedback, and practice with your advisor. In my experience, the first time I do a presentation is never the best presentation. So practicing can be really helpful, and getting some feedback. That's an opportunity to learn, like, where am I maybe spending too much time and going a little too into details, and people might be getting lost, versus it would be good to get into a little bit more detail. And as you practice, it allows you to do a couple of other things. The most important thing, maybe not the most important thing, but one of the very important things, is to not go over time when you're doing a research talk, because it makes it look like you didn't prepare well, and that you sort of maybe even didn't spend enough time caring to prepare well. And it means people can't ask you questions. And a lot of times audiences are expecting that opportunity. So it's critical that they have that time. So it's good to really practice to make sure you're not going to go over time. If anything, going a little short is better than going a little long. And then you do want to build in time for questions. Sometimes the schedule you get will have that built in, but sometimes it may not. So usually we think about at least 10 minutes for questions, or but maybe not more than 25% of the total allotted time that you're going to have to present, because you do want to cover some ground. And so if it's too short of a presentation, that can raise questions as well. But time for questions from the audience is really important. And as you're thinking about all this practice, how many times you practice is going to depend on you. For some people, a couple of times maybe is enough to get the jitters out and feel good. And practicing more ends up, meaning that they feel a little extra nervous. And for other people, practicing 5, 6, 7 times may help with the anxiety. So you have to be the judge of what helps with you in that particular regard. Again, the goal is not to memorize this part of, you don't want to memorize your research talk, but you do want to be able to talk about it smoothly and comfortably. You want to be able to, if you get kind of lost in a moment, pick back up. You never know what will happen. Maybe somebody walks into the room late and they're really loud, they're sitting down stuff, and you get distracted, the whole room gets distracted. You want to be able to find your way back easily, comfortably. That will communicate a lot of positive things about you during the interview. Do get feedback on your presentation skills as you're practicing. Sometimes, you might discover that maybe you're not making a lot of eye contact, or maybe you talk really fast and you want to intentionally slow down a little bit in this particular type of presentation, because maybe you're covering some, sort of detailed and sophisticated stuff, and you want to make sure the audience really understands what you're talking about. It's also good to have people ask you questions so you can sort of get practice answering questions as part of that talk. And just a little bit more about the research talk itself. Usually you'll have some time in the schedule when you're interviewing right before the research talk to prep. It might be only 15 minutes, it could be a half hour. I don't think I've seen it as more than a half hour, but it's some time to prep. And the goal is to use it in whatever way is best for you. So for some people, that might be kind of running through the presentation in their head ahead of time. For other people, maybe it's sort of like a moment of silence or meditation that's going to help them sort of center and feel confident. So those are, that's an important time to think about what will help me in that time period. And of course, part of that may also be getting your materials ready for the presentation, whether it's pulling them up from the web or maybe from a flash drive, depending upon the nature of your talk and how you're going to have it set up. During the presentation, I kind of hinted at this already, be prepared for the unexpected. Things can happen. Power can go out to the PowerPoint, to the projector that's showing your slides if you've got a PowerPoint. Sometimes, as I said, people might walk in. There's just a lot of different ways the unexpected can happen. And it's great to practice sort of recovering if you get lost in that, if you are distracted. So that can be a good practice goal as well. One of the things that happens is as you're responding to those unexpected moments, recovering if there's a big distraction, it communicates a lot to the people interviewing you about your style. How do you work with other people? If you get really frustrated because somebody walked in and made noise, that ends up being interpreted to mean something about what you might be like as a colleague or as an instructor or teacher. So it's a chance to show how you manage disruption and interruption, and also communicates confidence. So the research talk, of course, at the foundational level is about demonstrating your expertise, your research expertise. But it's also communicating what you're going to be like as a colleague and as a teacher. So, that's where having it be polished, being able to manage questions well, you could have somebody who asks kind of a combative question. Sometimes it happens, in academia, we do this thing where we could critique another's work, and that could happen. You could get a critiquing question during the Q&A part of the research talk. And so finding a way to respond to those kinds of questions, in a way that's inviting and doesn't get into an argumentative mode is going to be really critical. I kind of talked about the timepiece already, and tailoring to the audience, but those are just good things to remember. And, discussion is good, and discussion amongst the audience during the Q&A time can be okay as well. So it's important to keep that part in mind. So I mentioned before a teaching demonstration. So this is less common, but it does sometimes happen. And a lot of those same tips from the research talk still apply. But this is intentionally a time for you to give an overview of what you would be like as a teacher. And so again, there's going to be a certain amount of time blocked for it, and hopefully there's some time for Q&A that if it's not blocked out, you'll want to make time for it. But with the teaching demonstration, sometimes people will start with a little bit of an overview of, here's my teaching style, and that can be a good thing, but you'll want to keep it to just a few minutes. And then as you're thinking about a teaching demonstration, I think the most critical thing to understand is you can't cover a whole class lesson in a teaching demonstration because they're almost never as long as a normal class session would be. And so you sort of want to pick something, and you want to pick something that's interesting and that you are, able to present in a way that's engaging with the audience. Lectures, there can be master lecturers who are just phenomenal to watch lecturing. If you're not one of those people, you want to make sure it's an interactive demonstration. It's really an opportunity for you to illustrate this is a skill I bring as a teacher. And of course, if there are going to be students in the audience, it's great to tailor whatever that content you're going to cover is to the students. So figuring out, are they undergrad students, grad students, maybe where are they in the program? What are the sort of things that most excite the students in the program? Those sorts of things. So that's the teaching demonstration in a nutshell. I have just a few more tips that I wanted to touch base on. So, as you're thinking about interviewing, it's important to keep in mind that academia is kind of a small world. I'm in a discipline where there's about 70 programs across the country that offer my specific degree program, and we kind of know each other. So you want to think about that as you're, planning the interview, engaging in the interview. You want to avoid pulling out of an interview at the last minute if you can. You might maybe you have 4 interviews and your first interview offers you the job right away, and it's your most ideal job, and you're not going to consider any of the other ones anyway. Then obviously, and that can be a moment to say, I was offered a job and I'm pretty sure I'm going to take it. So rather than continue to waste everyone's time, I'm going to go ahead and back out. But to the extent you can avoid pulling out of an interview at the last minute, you want to do that. If you're already considering a job when you're offered the interview, it's good to let them know so they're sort of aware that you're on a time clock. Don't do the interview if you know you wouldn't take the job. You know, a lot of times people say, oh, interviews are good practice, and that's true. But particularly if the university is paying for you to come to the campus, they don't want to pay to bring people to campus if you have zero interest in working on their campus. So that's an important to think about as well, to sort of monitor where you're at. You know, a lot of times it may be that you discover you really would be interested in working there if you go interview. But if you've absolutely made up your mind, then it's best not to take up people's time and resources. And then of course being respectful. So that means to everyone you meet. You never know who's connected to who on a university campus. You know, sometimes people will be rude to someone and they think, oh, that person's not a faculty member, it doesn't matter. But that person might be very, very connected to faculty members. And in the end, everybody matters and wants to be treated respectfully. So that's just a good practice to have. Throughout your interview, it's good to read the room. You know, that's harder if it's on Zoom like we are now, but it's good to try to get a sense of how are people responding to me throughout the interview. After the interview, so some people will say send thank you notes, and some people say don't send thank you notes. And I don't know that there's truly a rule on this. They can be nice. They may not be expected, and don't be upset if people don't really respond back to the thank you notes. And the thank you notes sometimes are just sent via email at this point. So sort of good to keep in mind that there's really not a set standard. You know, again, there are a lot of people who say always send a thank you note, and they can be nice, but some people may also sort of interpret that as, you know, now I got to respond to a thank you note. So just something to keep in mind. If you do send it, you know, you want to be fairly brief. It is okay to send it if you have follow-up questions. That's a great time to say thank you so much. I have another question. I'm hoping I can, you know, get a little bit more information about this. So that is okay. The last thing I'll share, you know, after the interview, the timeline is not standardized across campuses. So, you know, it might be that you are told we'll have an answer in about a week, and you are called the next day, and maybe you're offered the position, or maybe you're told the position is filled. But it could also be you were told that we'll have an answer in about a week, and it turns out 3 weeks later you're still waiting. And that might not mean anything about where you fall in terms of who they want to offer the position to. You know, higher ed is an interesting thing, and so sometimes a lot of people have to sign off on something before an official offer can be made. Sometimes policies change as various, you know, individuals change. Sometimes that's happening in the human resource department. Sometimes it's happening in the dean's office. So it's just really important to not get too caught up in like, I haven't heard from them, you know, it's bad news, because it might not be. So that's an important thing to think about. On the flip side, you know, maybe this is your top choice and you have a job offer from another institution and you kind of have to make a decision. You know, that would be a time where you can communicate, and maybe they'll be able to say, you know, we really hope you won't pull out. We're planning to offer you the position, but we can't do so officially yet. Or they may not be able to say anything, but you can let them know if you have to make a decision about another job offer. At the same time, you do want to avoid inquiring too often about the status of the search, just because, you know, if HR or the dean's office has, you know, maybe caused the department to have to move more slowly than they planned, it can be kind of a frustrating thing for the chair of the search committee that, you know, they feel like they're making excuses, and nobody feels good if something takes longer than expected. So it's okay to inquire, but, you know, like once a week would be way too often to inquire and follow up. You know, I think a couple weeks out, you know, again, there's some judgment. Maybe talking to your advisor would be a good way to judge, you know, is it appropriate for me to follow up again? So that's just an important sort of post-interview thing to think about. All right, so that is the end of the sort of presentation, but I do want to see if there are questions.